Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. Well, I am back in the land of South Africa, where the temperature has plummeted back to winter depths, and we are continuing our exploration of how to use sieges in your game to add just another element of mystery, intrigue, and romance to your campaigns. Now, particularly the title for this is 12 Ways in Which You Can Include Your Players and Their Characters in a Siege. Now, this is assuming two things. Either the players' characters are part of the besieging force, or they are part of the besieged force. If they are neither in between, that opens up a whole bunch of other options, which this video doesn't necessarily look at. Now, before we look at the 12 ways in which you can involve your characters in the siege, you need to understand one fundamental thing. Now, although we looked at a whole lot of things about sieges in the previous videos, what we need to look at now is how does the enemy or how does the besieger plan on winning the battle? Now, usually a siege is formed either out of desperation. The army simply cannot afford to let the other army out of the castle, so they besiege the castle, or perhaps it's something that's purposefully done to simply maintain a blockade, in which case then no starships can leave the planet's surface, and the planet is effectively besieged. So there needs to be some kind of reason for the siege in the first place, and the besiegers need to have some kind of plan as to how they are going to ultimately defeat the besieged. Are they going to starve them out? Are they going to simply force them to capitulate and surrender because they have no alternative? What are their actual means to an end in the case of a siege? Once you've determined that, and there are many, but again, if you look at the geography of the environment in which the besiegers are stuck, if you look at the resources that are available to the besieged or to the besiegers, if you look at all of those kind of things, usually you can figure out a factor. And 9 times out of 10, it was literally a starvation of resources. Either they're running out of air, or they're running out of water, they're running out of food, or any number of those things, or they're running out of ammunition, anything basically to cause the army that is being besieged to surrender. Now, once you've worked that out, then you're golden. And we can now look at the 12 different ways in which you can incorporate your characters into a siege so that they feel as if they have some kind of value and are not just innocent bystanders. Now, once again, the next video that I'm going to do is on mass combat, which will play a part in this video to a degree, but it's a whole different kettle of fish altogether. So we will be looking at that in an upcoming video. And you don't necessarily need to know it for these 12 steps either. So here we go. In the pre-siege phase, there are several things, 5 different things as a matter of fact, that you can have your PCs do. And I find that these are very effective because it puts the PCs right at the core of the siege, and whichever side they happen to be on. Now, the first thing, of course, is the discovery and either retreat or the discovery and inform. So if the players' characters are part of the besieging army, that is that they're going to go and surround a castle or take a planet system, they need to go and discover the information about this particular castle or station that they are going to besiege. If they are part of the besieged, they need to be out on some random quest, and the more random you can make it, the better. If it has nothing to do with the city, that's fantastic, but they need to discover this army that's on approach to besieging the castle, or the planet, or the space station, or whatever it happens to be. Now, they obviously need to then get back to the castle and inform the powers that be. Hopefully, that's what they decide to do. If they decide to stand back and let the siege happen, well, they're no longer in a siege environment, are they? Now they're in a different type of adventure altogether, so it becomes redundant for them to carry on with the siege and be involved in that. So, assumedly, they rush back to the castle and inform the lords, "There is a giant army coming, my lord. We must prepare ourselves. We must meet them out on the field of battle." To which, of course, the Lord will think and ponder and question and possibly give them some kind of reward. Preferably, they should meet someone who they can invest in, some NPC who comes to their aid and says, oh, you were so kind in bringing us this information. Is there anything that we can do to repay you? Is there any way that we can say thank you for the great deed that you have done? Let them invest a little bit in NPCs and that kind of thing. If, of course, they are rather scouting around and they're looking for the castle or the fortress that they need to go and besiege, then they can return back to the general and say, "My lord, we have discovered that they are completely unaware of our approach, and thus our attack will be most effective. I suggest we hasten our movement forward." That lord, of course, will also have an NPC who will want to reward the players for doing their due diligence and helping the cause, and will provide them with a certain amount of hook to bite into later on in the siege, and we'll use them a little bit later, as you'll see. Now, in either case, the second option that you have is spy work. Now, whether they've reported or not of the impending besiege or the impending siege, they will be instructed, well, since you know the lay of the land so well, or since you did so well in informing us of this impending approach, we want you to go and find out more information about their numbers. Don't engage them, simply learn more. Now, this is different to the next section that we're going to look at, and the reason why it's different is because this is a more passive approach. So now this is where your thieves start to shine through. Even a paladin can go and sit on a hill and count numbers and watch troop movements and that kind of thing. None of these are designed to be exceptionally long adventures, and they are part of the main adventure, which is the siege. So these are all very short little steps along the way, and you wouldn't necessarily use all of them. It does really just depend on how long you want the game to run for on this particular chapter in your story. So spy work affords the characters an opportunity to go and see what's happening, learn a little bit what's happening. It gives you the opportunity to identify villains that they might be able to fight, potential adversaries. It also gives you an opportunity to give the players the opportunity to see things that they might gain should they help one side or the other. A library which might be pillaged or plundered once the siege is concluded, for example. So then the next one, the third one, is infiltration. Now, infiltration is different from spy work. Spy work is simply a non-detached observation of information, gathering as much as they possibly can, where you can, of course, build in extra things. Oh, that castle actually has a wizard in residence. Or, well, that starship, we thought initially it was down on torpedoes, it's actually carrying extra. So that's what your spy work will reveal. Infiltration will reveal the strength of the troops, the readiness for the siege or for the besieging, all those kind of factors. And this is where you can really introduce more NPCs for the characters to really fall in love with or to absolutely hate. And it's an important thing to do because a siege can feel very technical and very impersonal if you don't have a lot of personalities running around. So you want to populate it with as many as you can, whether it's the surly chef who serves them breakfast at the cantina, or whether it is the old grumpy quartermaster who complains about not having enough arrows. Whatever it might be, the more personalities you add in, the better. Now, if you look at historical recounts of sieges that have happened in the past, most of them hinge around the personalities that were involved rather than the actual siege itself. One of my favourite sieges, the Siege of Mafeking, for example, between the British and the Boer forces during the Great South African War. The British won by telephone, but the person who made the telephone call, of course, was this wonderful individual known as Baden-Powell, the founder of the Scouts, and he used to shock his troops by bathing naked. That's right, he would actually take all his clothes off while he went bathing. That's the anecdote that gets remembered from the siege, not the actual technicalities of the siege, which was a protracted 3-month affair. None of that is remembered. The fact that he bathed naked was scandalous enough, and the fact that he used a telephone to communicate that his troops had encircled the Boers was a totally different story altogether. But again, it's the personality of the individual involved, not necessarily the actions of the Great Siege, that is remembered. So you want to plant as many NPCs in here as possible. Almost overload them if necessary, because remember, you can seed these NPCs for much later. 7 adventures later, they come across the same surly chef, who's now working at a local inn that the characters happen to have stopped at, and he can throw them out an adventure hook. Oh, remember that time we were involved in that siege and you kept complaining about my runny eggs? Well, I've heard a story about a goose that lays golden ones. Bet you're not too worried about them being runny now, are you? No. So you can do that. Infiltration is learning the lay of the land by being involved inside and almost pretending to be one of the allies of these individuals on whichever side you happen to be. Then the final pre-siege option that you have is diplomacy. The party, because of their familiarity perhaps with the race that's involved, or just because they've been involved in so many of these missions where they've gone off and they've discovered information and that sort of thing, have earned now the trust of the leader. And this is where we have to metagame it a little bit, that our heroes are in actual fact heroes, and so our leaders will rely on them rather than on their own trusted generals who've led countless successful sieges for advice and information as to what they should do next. And that might very well be to send them out to commit diplomacy. Now, one of this. What this means is this particular type of mission, the diplomacy mission, is the type of adventure that we throw in every now and again that doesn't involve combat. It involves lots of talking and persuasion and bluffing and deceptions and deceiving and reading body language and that kind of thing. But it's a moral dilemma for the characters to have to solve. If they know that the force that they are traveling with is far superior to the besieged force, then they might try and convince the besiegers to give in early, rather than to hold out and go through the bloody core of battle. Exactly the same is true if the invading army is coming in. Well, perhaps the players can find an amicable solution to both sides and thus avoid the siege altogether. Invariably and inevitably, it is your job to determine whether or not the players are convincing enough to do so, and if not, then to launch into the siege. Again, all it is doing is it's entrenching the players into the idea that they are part of the siege because directly and indirectly they've provided information that will lead to the success or the failure of the siege. They provided diplomatic recourse and they have either succeeded or they have failed, and now the outcome is the inevitable siege. Now, that leads us to the very first type of mission that you can give the players, and that is the combat mission. Now, this is repelling borders if they are part of the besieged, or it is the initial assault if they are part of the besiegers. Either way, the defending force or the attacking force needs to withdraw at a certain point. The attacking force withdraws because they've tested now the defenses of the space station and they now know where to strike next. Or the besiegers now are faced with an opportunity to withdraw a little bit into the inner bailey, perhaps leaving the outer bailey to the enemy forces who now have gained some ground, but not all of the ground. So combat, although it's going to happen throughout, you're going to find ample opportunity to throw in combat situations. Combat should only be used when it would make sense. So the besiegers are not always going to attack the castle walls every single time. The besieged are not going to be launching out attack parties every single time either. Combat should be, ironically, less in a siege, because that's not what a siege is about. As a matter of fact, a siege is all about avoiding combat. That's why it's a siege and not just a battle. So you can have combat as and when is necessary, and you'll see that it's going to slot in a lot more as we move down the remainder of the options that we have available to us. Now, Counterworks is where it starts to get particularly interesting. Counterworks is effectively the idea that as the besieged, the besiegers have got plasma cannons on those upper ridges, and those plasma cannons are raining death down onto our troops, breaking morale and destroying our walls. We must get rid of those plasma cannons. So the party is put together. Of course, it's the heroes who are chosen, and maybe if you want, you can add in other NPC hero groups that need to go off and take out different targets at the same time. Hit them from 4 different places at once, and they'll know that we are not going to ever surrender. It also gives us an opportunity of succeeding in 4 different places as opposed to just in one place. So the party now has to go out and they now have to sabotage this weapon. That's a whole adventure all on its own. They now have to go out, get through the troops, find the secret passageways that'll lead up to the plasma cannon, and then figure out how to destroy the plasma cannon without getting caught, and then have to return back. Now, this is the critical thing. If the party is part of the besieged, if they are the ones who are being encircled by the enemy, you need to give them sufficient motivation to come back. So once they've snuck into enemy lines, why don't they just carry on going? There needs to be some investment in the castle itself, in the besieged. And that's where all those NPCs that you've hopefully been throwing at them liberally, trying to find one that pulls on their heartstrings that will get them to come back every time. And it could be a friendly NPC horse who just takes a liking to the one player, or a dog, or a cat, or a whatever. You need to build something that's going to get the players to keep bringing their characters back into the battle rather than just having them flee away and go and find other adventures elsewhere. Of course, if they're attacking the castle, Counterworks is, there's a trebuchet on that tower and it keeps attacking our troops every time we try and attack the drawbridge. That trebuchet must come down, sneak into the castle somehow and take it down. But don't go further than that, because it's one small step at a time. Now that's something that's important. The lords must always make sure that they're most emphatic, that the characters cannot press further even if the opportunity presents. It is not about being heroes, although it is. It's not about being heroes, it's about following orders and doing things in the right way so that everyone else knows what they need to do as well. So Counterworks is a great opportunity for you to throw one or two little things into the player's paths that they need to go and solve first before they can do anything else, especially if those threats are particularly dangerous or particularly big. The next type of option that you can look at, and I would suggest that you use a multitude of these options because, again, it's about trying to make sure that the characters who are not combat heavy, but who are maybe talky heavy, get an opportunity to do stuff. It's about making sure that those that are more inquisitive get to solve problems. It's about making sure that those are combat orientated get enough combat in there so that everybody feels as if they're involved. And if you really like, you can split the party up and have them doing these different things at the same time to make it fairly dramatic. This will work provided that you can juggle multiple storylines in the air at the same time. Then what I would suggest you do is you roll initiative once and you keep the characters on that initiative and you just cycle through their different stories as their initiatives come up. So you keep bouncing around and try and move away at a cliffhanger moment before you move on to the next character, so that everyone's sort of sitting around the table desperate for their turn to come around. So one of the other things that you can do is the investigation. Now, investigations are twofold in this particular instance. In a siege type of situation, you have the investigation of an incident. The stores have been sabotaged. We need to find the saboteur. That's one way of looking at it. You can investigate the siege works. Are the walls holding up? There's some kind of damp in the corridors, that kind of thing. So the more technically minded players can really get stuck in there and go and look and investigate and do that kind of thing. The other type of investigation is, of course, the investigation of people. Someone seems to be letting the troops know exactly what's going to happen next. Within the castle, whenever we move the troops to the left-hand side, they seem to bolster their left-hand side defenses. Whenever we move starships around into that nebula, they seem to know that and move their ships away from the nebula. It's as if there is someone within our ranks who is giving out information. And that's a fantastic kind of witch hunt that you can have your players run off on and investigate quite fully. Again, though, the important thing is that you've set up all of those NPCs. The marshal, the warden, the quartermaster, the chef, the lord, the admiral, the captain, all of those kind of players now come into the fold and can be used even more so in terms of making this investigation that much more interesting. So the investigation becomes a story all on its own. Another option, which is kind of linked to investigation, is the seek and find option. Now, many years ago, there was a secret weapon installed on this battle station, but no one remembers where it is. If you can find it, you will save the day. That's an example of seek and find. It's about looking for something that someone has overlooked, missed, forgotten about, misplaced, is simply unknown. And that could be in the turn of an ancient book in a chapel that the old monks refer to, and oh, well, if only we had the holy weapon of Antioch, it might save us in our dire need, but alas and alack, it has been lost to the ages. Adventure hook. Number 1, players please go and investigate. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the siege except for the outcome, and that's important, is that a lot of these missions don't necessarily have anything to do with the siege themselves, but they link into it. So it's a great opportunity to practice your seeding, as well as to practice the idea of involving multiple storylines around a central point and having them have influence and impact into that central point. And we're going to look at all of that sort of influence that happens in mass combat in the next video. So the idea with seek and find is to send them to go and look for something that's been lost. Perhaps it's extra stores, perhaps it's some kind of key code. You decide. This is not a major mission type of thing, or it can be, it's entirely up to you, but generally it's a side note. Diplomacy is the next one. Now, I'm not talking necessarily diplomacy between the besieged and the besiegers. I'm talking, well, and certainly it can be, I'm sorry to be a bit scattered here, but certainly it can be the besiegers want to talk, where they offer terms for surrender, or the besieged need to send an envoy to seek terms of surrender. We cannot hold out anymore, we must surrender. Someone has to go and negotiate. Well, you've dealt with them before, you go and fix it now. Make sure that they don't kill us all, or that they don't enslave us or convert us, etc., etc., etc. So that's the one kind of diplomacy. The other kind of diplomacy, and again, this is the one that I personally prefer to mix into the whole idea of the siege, is the personal diplomacy. This is where the population starts to want to rebel against their leaders because the leaders are making stupid decisions. It's up to the players to want to have to go and engage with those people and try and diffuse the situation. Now, often the general population would overthrow their leaders, cast them out, and open the doors for the aggressors, as so often used to happen when Alexander was on campaign. The idea of being ruled by this monarch or that monarch, the general population don't really care as long as they can continue to go about their daily business of survival. And that's something that's come up in the past. People just want to survive and be happy. And if that means opening up the gate so that this idiot can take over instead of that idiot who's currently in charge, well then so be it. So diplomacy is often about working with people trying to smooth over things, especially if the besiegers start to argue amongst themselves. One general wants to be more militant and attack, the other one is more defensive. Either way, it's up to the players to try and negotiate that kind of situation. So that diplomacy allows the talky guys to get really involved. Then another option is escape. Now, escape is generally from the besieged. If you're in the castle, you have to escape with these very important documents. Make sure that they get into the hands of the right people and flee as fast as you can. We will hold out for as long as we can, but we can only buy you maybe a day before we fall to the aggressor. On the other hand, it might very well be that now that they've infiltrated into the castle, they now have to escape the castle to get back to their allies on the outer walls. That's an escape in its own right. So however you want to orchestrate that, and however you want to make it difficult, whether they're going through sewers that are infested with monsters and creatures, whether they are simply scaling the wall in the dead of night and trying to slip through disguised as enemy soldiers, however they decide to work it, it's in your hands. But the escape is a perfectly viable mission where they now have to leave. And of course it makes it more poignant if you've built in all those NPCs that I've been talking about throughout this entire video. Now, another option, and the last option here, is infiltration. Now, this is very similar to the first infiltration that we had when we were talking about the pre-siege. The infiltration here is about trying to get into the castle or out of the space station into the opposing forces. It's not an escape and it's not an investigation. It is an infiltration into the enemy to gain knowledge and understanding, and then they have to get back out into the castle or out of the space station back to their own people. So it is an undercover mission that has to succeed and they have to get back. So it's a go fetch kind of mission. Go fetch this information by infiltrating, becoming one with the enemy, then get out and come back and tell us what's going on. It's absolutely critical that we know what's going on. So all of those options, all 12 of those options, which break into their own options and move away and bring in all kinds of wonderful stories, those are at your disposal when you are running a siege. And it's a very powerful type of story that you can tell because it's contained around a central point, and if you tell it well enough and if you include enough NPCs to get the players invested into staying with that siege, then you can really explore multiple sessions with different types of talkie adventures, exploration adventures, combat adventures, riddle-solving adventures. There's a whole lot of options just waiting to be explored within the context of the siege. And what the siege does is it creates this wonderful pressure on the characters in order to perform. If they fail, a whole community is at risk of being executed. If they succeed, there's an amazing reward that is waiting for them because it is such a high-stakes kind of situation. Sieges are very, very, very critical for campaigning. They advance the cause of those that are trying to take over the castle significantly. They suddenly have a home base from now which to move forward. Of course, the defenders need their homes, and so they need to defend with everything they have. So there's some wonderful opportunities for role-playing. There's some wonderful NPC opportunities. There's that forced pressure that one wrong slip will cause the enemy to move in closer or to push the army further away. I hope this has been enlightening and has helped you to look at sieges in a totally different way and to see them for the golden opportunities that they are. Now, in the next video, we're going to look at mass combat, and we're going to look into see how you can do it without having reams and reams and reams and reams and reams and reams of numbers and pages of dice rolls to try and keep track of everything, and how you can make it entertaining and fun and totally based almost on all of the decisions that the players make, so that it feels as if they're having a direct impact, even though they're not necessarily involved. So, until next time, I wish you, well, before I say that, sorry, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, join us on Facebook, and become a Patreon if you like, and join us on Facebook for even more. And of course, bonus videos that the Patreons get every week as well. So, until next time, I wish you the happiest of gaming.